Out of the frankly ridiculous amount of games Square Enix is releasing in these last 4 months of the year, we have one game that appears to take heavy inspiration from the Rune Factory series, that is, Harvestella. As it's hard to see something that is both a farming sim and an action RPG and not assume there wasn't at least some influence. This most recent direct they announced a demo with save transfer, and I spent almost 3 hours getting to the end of chapter 2 before my calendar limit with said demo was up. Aside from being familiar with the genre, I didn't watch the treehouse footage, so I only knew a little bit about the game. Harvestella was something I was somewhat unsure on until playing this, and I have since decided I am definitely picking it up. Rest in pieces, Store of Seasons Doraemon 2. While they're still keeping mum on whether or not there will be any romance, I am impressed enough that I will likely play it regardless. That said, I really want to make the Doctor mine, because she is indeed very fine. Nonetheless, it is a story-focused adventure, so I at least have that to push me through. You start out as the usual amnesiac that is given a farm to keep yourself occupied enough to avoid depression, according to the good doctor. Oh, and also there's a season of death that you happen to walk into and nearly died from, large mysterious crystals and odd creatures the locals detest called Omen. You insist on rescuing an injured Omen who turns out to be a regular human girl, but believes themselves to have ended up in the past due to the lack of technology and her supposedly superior fashion sense. So the story covers that and your journey to rescue her after she decides to run off on her own. But during all this you engage in farming, action combat, and importantly, time management. Starting with farming, I was interested in some of the improvements to typical genre norms, such as the water not needing to be refilled, and the tools existing in a separate space from your backpack. Some crops grow extraordinarily fast, to the extent I was worried the seasons will be shorter, but I imagine it could still be the standard 30 or so. It wasn't too finicky to control as you slow down when using tools, so you strafe, but if it's too far away you'll stop strafing and then likely hit the wrong spot. There is also a crafting system as you make various items such as your own tools, a home teleport, and eventually, well I didn't because I spent all my money on upgrades, but you could have probably bought a kitchen and started cooking your own food, and all of these activities do take up a little bit of time. I also saw what appears to be a much larger field, so I imagine that might be where the animal barns get built. As is the norm at the start of the game, your resources are spread incredibly thin. I went back to unlock fishing, which is basic, but does appear to slow down time, or at least it doesn't use as much as it feels like it takes. There are these standard stores that require a mix of resources and cash, though one convention I've yet to see is whether there'll be any festivals or if the story is somehow too serious for regular celebrations to occur. The combat, meanwhile, was something I felt a bit mixed on. You have a stamina bar that gets used up when you run or use your farm tools, but having eating something can auto-regenerate that. Fighting doesn't seem to affect that, however, as you have your standard attack and a cooldown move which don't use your stamina. Some enemies have telegraphed attacks, so definitely learn to avoid markings on the ground if you aren't used to those in games. Speaking of, we have the big scary enemies labelled as Fear, notable by the shadow around them, who are obviously over-leveled compared to fellow monsters in the area. Thankfully, in the first dungeon, they seem to be very interested in napping and were easy to walk around, whereas I imagine later on in the game, similar enemies will have a path that they follow and you'll need to avoid them. There wasn't a dedicated dodge until I'd unlocked it, and that was tied to a particular job, which I'm not a fan of dodging being tied to just one class so far. As you get into the first dungeon of the game, you'll gain access to a second job, which is a ranged magic class, and switching between will allow you to exploit weaknesses, but the change is on a pretty large cooldown. Classes also gain job points as you use them, which gives you more abilities and permanent stat buffs. Of course, you can upgrade your equipment and wear accessories. It's also here where you find a party member who unfortunately does not revive you, so make sure to save the crystals if you want to avoid wasting time and money with the doctor's fee. This is probably more of a me issue, but I had a bit of a struggle with the controls layout, as you'll press ZR or use the D-pad between different inventories mid-gameplay, but I kept getting mixed up and ended up doing things like inhaling 3 chunks of raw meat. Dungeon exploration involves creating shortcuts using repair kits that also took an hour out of your day for some reason, meaning that when you next travel, assuming it's by the nearest teleport crystal, you won't have to run past as many monsters, or you might even build a bridge solely to get some treasure chests, so the optional time and resources used are up to you. Going forward, I'd say to always have one teleport item on you and a good 2 or 3 repair kits so you don't have to trek back to the farm and waste your day. One fun touch to exploration was that you'd find prompts such as whether or not to eat a certain mushroom or look for something in the water, which may give you an item at the cost of your health and time. Your bedtime is strictly midnight with a 6 and 10 PM warning to get back home. Unfortunately, time was quite an issue in the early game, as you'd wake up bombarded with story events, some of which meant your actual day to play didn't start until 2 PM, which is unimaginably inconsiderate, and I hope that peters down past the tutorial phase. It really gets in the way of planning anything. Whereas the normal days seem to start at 6 AM or so, giving you much more time to manage chores and dungeon crawling. The passage of time is a little fast, but aside from however this quietest thing works, I imagine there's not too many complete in X day tasks to worry about, or at least I hope there isn't. Whenever going between locations you have to manually walk, and that takes up time, which I was going to suggest gets changed, but by looking at information it appears you eventually get a mount. The fast travel crystals are all tied to their specific area aside from being able to go straight home, so there's no quick trips to the shops and back from the dungeons. The music was very relaxing and I enjoyed the subtlety of it. I played the whole thing docked, but I'm quite impressed with the visuals. They've gone with a particular style, and while I don't like the animal-like eyes on the people, overall they have a doll-like look to them in terms of shape and hair detail. Environments themselves look great, with the design and lighting really helping it to look pretty. I do wish that the resources you picked up were shown visually rather than just being a UI element though. Graphics are always a concern I have with 3D farming sims, as they often get the short end of the stick in terms of appearance, which can be quite a turn-off for me. Having played a smidgen handheld while writing this, I finally noticed the blurriness some people were talking about, and it's pretty unfortunate. One thing that gave me a bit of a shock was when I suddenly heard voice acting from my party member, as literally no other aspect of the game has it, which made me wonder why they bothered putting it in the most repetitive part, being the combat. The story itself seems relatively intriguing, and we have some funny moments, especially with a hypocritical unicorn. And like I said, I am impressed enough though, a little not entirely sold on the combat, that I will get this game even if they won't let me marry the thick-thighs doctor. I will likely not be reviewing this as the game comes out early November and is thus far too close to my due date to commit to, but I am looking forward to playing it on my own time. What do you think?